Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at maybe the biggest question there is. What is this universe, really? And how did it all start?
But we're taking a bit of an unusual route, following the path C.S. Lewis laid out.
Right, not starting with, telescopes or physics, which might seem the obvious place.
No, Lewis begins somewhere totally different. He starts with the one thing he says we know from the inside. Our own human sense of right and wrong. Morality.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I imagine some listeners might think, hold on, morality, isn't that subjective? How can that tell us about the universe? Why start there?
Well, Lewis argues it's actually the most certain thing we know in a specific way. He needs to draw a really sharp distinction first.
A distinction between what?
Between the laws of nature, like gravity, and this law of human nature, or moral law.
Okay.
See, for a stone or a tree, the laws of nature are just descriptions, aren't they? They're how we talk about what matter does. Gravity isn't something telling the stone to fall, it's just what stones do.
We're just describing the observed facts. There's nothing sort of above the facts telling the stone what it ought to do.
Exactly. But Lewis says the moral law is different. It's not just describing how humans do behave. Often we behave quite contrary to it.
Right. We know we ought to be honest or fair, even when we aren't. It feels like a real command we're breaking.
Precisely. When someone is dishonest, we don't just say, oh, well, guess the law of honesty needs updating. We feel they've failed to meet a standard that exists independently of their actions.
So with humans, there's something besides the actual facts of behavior. There's this sense of ought.
And that, Lewis argues, is our crucial piece of inside information. It's the clue we have that things like stones and trees don't.
Okay, so armed with that distinction, that clue, Lewis then looks at the big picture. What are the fundamental ways people have tried to explain the universe?
He boils it down to two main views that have basically always been around.
What's the first one?
The first is the materialist view. Essentially, matter and space just happen to exist and always have. No one knows why.
Just brute fact.
Brute fact. And this matter, behaving according to fixed physical laws, eventually, through a series of massive flukes, produced creatures like us.
He uses that striking language, flukes, like one chance in a million something hit the sun just right, another chance in a billion the chemicals formed life.
Yeah, pure chance. Life, developing consciousness, developing a sense of morality, all just accidental byproducts of mindless physical processes over immense time.
But hang on, couldn't you argue that given enough time, like infinite time or a huge universe, even incredibly unlikely things become almost inevitable? Maybe consciousness had to happen eventually.
That's a fair point, and modern cosmology does wrestle with that, but Lewis would likely bring it back to the kind of thing we're talking about.
Meaning?
Even if you can't explain the existence of consciousness as an eventual statistical outcome, does that explain the content of consciousness? Specifically, this non-negotiable feeling of ought.
Okay. So the materialist view might explain the how of consciousness emerging, maybe, but not the why of the moral law within it. Where'd that feeling of obligation come from if it's all just atoms bumping around?
Exactly. The materialist view struggles to account for a prescriptive, non-invented law that tells us how we should behave, not just how we do.
Which naturally leads to Lewis's second fundamental option.
The religious view.
And what's the core idea there?
The core idea is that behind the universe, the ultimate reality is something more like a mind than anything else we know.
A mind. So conscious, with
Yeah.
purposes.
Yes. Conscious, has intentions, prefers some things over others. And this mind created the universe, at least partly, to produce creatures that are in some way like itself. Creatures with minds.
And Lewis emphasizes these aren't like an ancient view versus a modern scientific one. He says these two basic outlooks, materialist and religious, have always been the main contenders wherever people have thought seriously about reality.
Right, it's a fundamental fork in the road about what reality is. Is it ultimately mindless stuff, or is there an intelligence behind it all?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. If these are the two big options, why can't science just settle it? We have incredible tools now. Why can't science tell us if there's a mind behind it all or not?
Because of what science is and what it does, Lewis is very clear here. Science works by observation and experiment.
Watching things, measuring things.
Exactly, watching how things behave. Every scientific statement, no matter how complex it sounds, ultimately boils down to something like, I pointed my instrument at X and observed Y, or I applied condition Z and this happened.
So it's describing the what and the how of things within the universe.
Precisely, which means questions like, why is there a universe at all? or does the universe have a meaning or purpose, are simply not scientific questions. They're outside the scope of what the scientific method can address.
Even if science became totally complete, knew every particle, every force.
Even then, Lewis's point is that even if you had a complete description of every single fact inside the universe, the question of why those facts exist, or whether there's anything behind them, would remain unanswered by science itself. Science describes the house. It can't tell you if there was an architect or why they built it.
He seems quite critical of people who claim science has disproven anything beyond the material.
He is, and he often points out it's usually not the top-tier scientists making those claims. They tend to understand the limits of their discipline better. It's more often popularizers, maybe journalists or writers, who overstep and say science has answered the ultimate why questions.
Okay, so if looking at the universe from the outside, like science does, can't reveal if there is a mind or power behind it, where else can we look?
Back to the one place we have inside access.
Yeah, ourselves.
Right. Lewis says this is the crucial step. We don't just observe humans like we observe electricity or cabbages. We are human. We have, as he puts it, inside information.
Like having the user manual for one specific machine in the factory.
Sort of. Imagine trying to understand humans purely from external observation, without language, without ever knowing what it feels like to be human. You'd record our actions, our biology, maybe even map our brains.
But you'd never detect the moral law that way. You'd only see what we did, not what we felt we ought to do.
Exactly. So, connecting the dots. If there's some controlling power behind the universe, something making the facts be as they are, just observing those facts won't find it.
Because you're just looking at the effects, not the cause behind them.
If that power wanted to reveal itself, where could it do so? The only way it could show itself to us directly is inside us, as an influence or a command, urging us towards a certain kind of behavior.
And that's precisely what we find with the moral law. That feeling of ought.
It's a remarkable convergence. The one place we could potentially find evidence of a directing power from the inside is exactly where we find this inexplicable pressure to behave morally.
This leads to his analogy about the postman, doesn't it?
Yes, the postmen leaving packets at every house. We assume they're letters because the one delivered to us, the one we're allowed to open, contains a letter.
So the packet labeled man is the only one we can open from the inside.
And when we open it, what do we find? Not just random biochemical reactions, but a message, a law, a sense that somebody or something wants us to behave in a certain way.
So the reasonable conclusion is that the other packets, the rest of the universe, likely originated from the same sender who put the message inside us.
That's the inference Lewis draws, and he's very careful at this stage. He stresses he hasn't arrived at the God of Christian theology or any specific religion yet.
Right, not yet. What has he reached?
He's reached what he calls a something, a power behind the universe which appears to be directing things and which manifests inside us as this moral law that urges us to do right and makes us feel, well, responsible and uncomfortable when we do wrong.
And crucially, this something must be more like a mind than like matter.
Because, as he dryly notes, you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions. Purpose, commands, morality, these point towards mind.
So we've logically moved from the internal feeling of ought to the existence of a directing mind behind reality. But before going further, Lewis pauses to address a kind of middle ground view, right?
Yes, a very popular alternative, especially in his time, but still around now, sometimes called life force philosophy or creative evolution. Thinkers like George Bernard Shaw or Henri Bergson were associated with it.
What's the appeal of that view?
It suggests life didn't evolve just by random chance, but through a sort of inner striving, a purposiveness, a life force pushing evolution upwards and onwards.
That sounds nicer than pure chance, I suppose. It gives a sense of progress, maybe meaning, without necessarily invoking a traditional god.
Exactly. It feels spiritual-ish, maybe comforting. You feel carried along by this grand evolving force. But Lewis immediately asks the sharp question. This life force, does it have a mind or not?
Okay, why is that the critical question?
Because if you say, yes, it does have a mind, it knows what it's doing, it has purpose as well, then you're just describing the religious view, basically God, maybe using different words.
You haven't actually found a third option.
Right. But if you say no, the life force does not have a mind, it's blind. Then Lewis asks how you can possibly say it strives or has purposes.
Purpose implies intent. Striving implies direction. A mindless force can't intend or strive. It just acts according to its nature, like gravity.
Precisely. So Lewis argues this life force idea is trying to have it both ways. It gives you, as he puts it, the emotional comfort of believing in God and none of the less pleasant consequences.
What does he mean by less pleasant consequences?
Responsibility, judgment, moral demands. With a personal God, there might be commandments, expectations, accountability.
But with a blind, impersonal life force.
Well, when you're feeling energetic and good, you can feel part of its wonderful surge forward. But if you want to do something rather shabby, as Lewis says,
This blind force won't care. It has no moral compass. It won't interfere or judge you.
it's convenience itself. Which leads Lewis to call it potentially a sort of tame God, or maybe even the greatest achievement of wishful thinking, feeling religious without the demands of religion.
So Lewis effectively dismisses that third way as intellectually incoherent, or perhaps just wishful thinking.
He sees it as ultimately collapsing back into either the materialist view, if it's mindless, or the religious view, if it has a mind.
Okay, so wrapping this leg of the journey up, we started with that unique internal knowledge, the moral law, the ought.
The inside information.
And following Lewis's logic, this leads us to conclude there must be something behind the universe. And then something is more like a mind than like mindless matter.
A mind that has communicated a preference, a standard to us.
So what does this all mean right now, at this point in the argument?
It means we're not adrift in a meaningless universe of chance, according to Lewis. We are fundamentally under a kind of command.
But it's a strange kind of command, isn't it, compared to the laws of physics?
Very different. As Lewis beautifully puts it, the stone must obey the law of gravity. It has no choice. But the sender of the message inside us merely tells us, humans, to obey the law of our human nature, the moral law.
We're told what we ought to do, but we're clearly free to ignore it.
And we frequently do. Which brings us to the threshold of the next big question, really.
Which is,
If this moral law, perceived internally, is our primary clue about the nature of the mind behind the universe, what does our persistent failure to live up to that law tell us?
what does the gap between the ought and the I's imply about our relationship with that mind?
Exactly. If we know the standard and constantly fall short, feeling responsible and uncomfortable, that gap itself becomes the next critical piece of data. What does that tell us about the architect and ourselves? That's where Lewis heads next.